Elmina Castle. The Elmina Castle was built in 1482 on Ghana's coast. It began as a Portuguese gold trading post before the Dutch seized it and turned it into one of the most important stops on the Atlantic slave trade route in 1637. At its peak, up to 30,000 enslaved Africans passed through the castle each year on their way to the Americas. Hundreds of them were held in dark and dirty underground dungeons. Men and women were held, separated in suffocating dungeons with no toilets, no bathrooms, and even no fresh air. They had to sleep on the floor, chained by their feet, enduring inhumane conditions. Prisoners were inspected by having their teeth counted and being beaten to test their strength. The rebellious ones were locked in extreme, tiny, airless cells where they had no room to lie down. Many prisoners died from suffocation, disease, and starvation while waiting for the slave ships. Those who survived went to face even greater horrors on the high seas. Diyarbakir Prison. The Diyarbakir Prison was built in early 1980 in southeastern Turkey. It soon became a nightmare following the military coup in September 1980. The prison was converted into a martial law military prison where torture had become a routine. Kurds, who are an ethnic group native to the Middle East, mainly living in Turkey and other Middle East countries, were the main victims for this prison. Almost 600,000 Kurdish were detained, and most of them were beaten and treated harshly. They were specifically targeted in order to destroy their cultural and ethnic identity. Kurdish prisoners were deprived of sleep for days, denied of food and water until they were close to die. They were also given electric shocks in sensitive areas of the body. The prisoners were forced to eat broken glass and crawl naked through sewage. Guards ripped out their healthy teeth and nails simply to inflict pain. Prisoners were also subject to psychological torture and were kept in solitary confinement in dark cells for months. Some were hung from their arms for hours until their shoulders were dislocated. The Diyarbakir prison was closed in 2022, with reported inmate death toll estimates ranging between 34 and 300. Tadmor Prison. This Syrian prison was located near the desert town of Palmyra, which is 200 kilometers northeast of Damascus. This prison was originally formed as barracks by French Mandate forces in the 1930s. After Syria gained independence in 1946, the barracks became a prison under control of the Syrian military. In the 1970s, under the rule of Hafez al-Assad, the prison was expanded to house political prisoners. On the 27th of June 1980, a day after the assassination attempt on President Assad, nearly 550 troops were sent to the prison with orders to execute prisoners. Few hours after, between 600 and 1,000 prisoners were killed in their cells with firearms. At its peak, between 1980 and 1990, over 20,000 Syrians were imprisoned at the Tadmor Prison. The human rights organizations described it as one of the worst places of systematic mistreatment, where prisoners were subjected to both physical and psychological torture, minimal food and water supplies, and severe deprivation of medical care, causing numerous deaths. Its desert location made conditions even worse. The extreme heat in cells reached over 120 degrees Fahrenheit without ventilation, leading to additional deaths from dehydration and heat exhaustion. The Tadmor prison closed in 2001, but it was reopened in 2011 during the Syrian civil war, with similar conditions. ISIS forces destroyed it in 2015. La Modelo Prison. La Modelo Prison is located in Bogotá, Colombia. It was designed to hold nearly 2,000 prisoners. The founders of this prison aimed to rehabilitate the prisoners rather than punish them, with structured pavilions and workshops under control of state authority. By the late 1960s, the prison rapidly became overcrowded with the arrival of different individuals, including political detainees, common criminals, and members of guerrilla groups, which led to the beginning of both corruption and violence inside the prison. In 1967, most of the prison staff were corrupted. They were allowing weapons to enter, which made the prison's environment so dangerous that led to the first major internal shootout, causing guards to lose control inside the prison. Between 1970 and 1980, La Modelo reached its peak, holding more than 7,000 prisoners. Tension began rising inside the prison as gangs started taking control using firearms, making the prison totally unsafe. In 1979, 10 prisoners escaped by blasting a wall with dynamite. In the 1990s, with the escalation of armed conflict and drug wars in Colombia, numerous paramilitary members joined La Modelo. The prison reached its extreme tensions, which led the prison to be divided into rival factions, where paramilitaries, guerrillas, and criminal gangs were the main ones, enforcing their own rules. By 1997, violence had become a routine in La Modelo, to the point where prison authorities were unable to intervene safely, and this led to one of the deadliest events in the prison on 27th of April, 2000, where rival factions engaged in a violent confrontation involving paramilitary groups and other inmates. This event caused 32 deaths, 17 severe injuries, and 17 sudden disappearances after a 12-hour conflict. In 2016, people finally found out how violent La Modelo was in the past, when remains of at least 100 missing prisoners were discovered in the prison's drainage system. On the 21st of March 2020, in the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, prisoners protested due to overcrowding and the risk of contagion. The protests escalated into a major riot, leaving 24 deaths and 83 injuries. La Modelo was closed in 2016 after decades of violence. Phu Quoc Prison. This prison is known as the Coconut Tree Prison, which is located on the Phu Quoc Island in Vietnam. It was initially built by French colonial authorities around 1950 to detain political dissidents and Vietnamese revolutionary fighters during the First Indochina War against French colonialism. The conditions were already harsh in the early years of its existence. Prisoners were used as labor, building, repairing, digging, and maintaining fortifications and fences, while exposed to extreme heat in summer, heavy rain and cold in winter, under extreme duress with inadequate food, poor sanitation with no medical care. After the defeat of French colonialism by South Vietnamese forces, known as the Viet Minh in 1954, the prison became under control of the state of Vietnam with the support from the US. After 1954, when Vietnam was divided, the North Vietnamese government sought to re-establish the country under communist rule. The South, supported by the US, saw it as actions against the state, which led the Phu Quoc Prison to become the main facility for the North Vietnamese soldiers. By the mid-1960s, the prison was expanded to be one of the world's largest prison camps, holding up to 40,000 prisoners. The prison's inhuman treatment became worse than ever, to a point where it was described as hell on earth. Prisoners were regularly subjected to brutal conditions, up to 180 prisoners per cell, designed for 50. Food consisted only of rice and salt, and devastating features like the tiger cage, which it was a concrete and barbed wire structure measuring 5 by 9 feet and 3 feet high. Prisoners were forced to spend days in these cages, where they had to stay still to avoid being injured, exposed to extreme weather conditions. Prisoners were also subject to severe beatings and other documented methods of mistreatment I can't speak of. Many died from infections and diseases. These inhuman conditions led to many escape attempts. The famous one was in 1968, when over 2,600 prisoners broke through the perimeter fence. Most of them were later recaptured. The prison continued operating until it was closed in 1975, when the Republic of Vietnam collapsed. Pitesti Prison. The Pitesti Prison was built between 1938 and 1941, and it was considered at that time as Romania's most modern penitentiaries, having a chapel, an infirmary, and a centralized heating system. The prison started in its early years by housing common law prisoners. But after the World War II, things have changed with consolidation of communist rule in Romania. The prison became a tool of the regime and started housing new regime opponents, religious believers, former military officers, and even students. Between late 1949 and mid-1951, the Pitesti Prison was known by the Pitesti Experiment, or the Pitesti Program, one of the most brutal and systematic re-education program in Eastern Europe. Eugen Sukarno, a Pitesti political prisoner who had joined while imprisoned the communists, and his organization of other converted prisoners, known as the ODCC, the Organization of Detainees with Communist Convictions, were in charge of the Pitesti program with the involvement of the secret police. Over 1,000 students were subject to this program to destroy their personalities through what was called re-education. The program involved 3 phases of psychological breakdown. The first phase, called external unmasking, its purpose was to eliminate secrecy and break personal loyalty through forced confession. Prisoners were brutally mistreated and interrogated until they reveal all their personal beliefs and relations, including the names of their family members, friends, and fellow prisoners. The second phase, called the internal unmasking, victims were forced to denounce fellow prisoners and guards who showed any humanity. The goal was to destroy trust between prisoners. The last one, called public moral unmasking. In this phase, victims were suffering from a severe inhuman physical mistreatment along with food and sleep deprivation until they renounce all previous beliefs. Religious prisoners were forced to mock religious symbols and participate in mock ceremonies that desecrated their faith, especially during Christmas and Easter. The worst was the psychological manipulation of prisoners and forcing them to participate in the mistreatment of their closest friends. At least 100 students died and many developed permanent mental illness. After the end of the Pitesti program in 1951, the programs responsible Sukarno and 21 others were executed in 1954. The prison's permanent shutdown was in 1977.